Let's let everybody in.
Go ahead and admit. All right, here they come.
Welcome, everyone.
Good afternoon, everybody. We're going to give folks just another minute or two to join us because of we're worried that some folks might not have received the right link, but we've sent it out to everyone who registered, and I've got high level of confidence that everyone who wants to come today will be here. We're also, of course, live streaming, so folks can join us that way as well. And Diana, it's great to see you. How are you?
Good, thank you.
Good.
Hi, Diana.
Hi, I can see even friends from Australia online.
Oh, that's terrific.
That's great.
Great. That's great.
There's a lot of people joining right now.
Yeah, great.
And Diana, just to introduce you to Akiba Lerner, you probably see him on the.
I do.
So
Hi, nice to meet you.
Thank you for spending Sunday afternoon with
Well,
us.
thank you so much for bringing me. I feel deeply honored. Thank you.
at some point we'll arrange for the two of you to actually meet each other in person. You know, and I hear Diana, you have a reputation of creating a wonderful reception for this event, and so we look forward to returning to that in the future.
Next year.
Yes, exactly. So why don't we get started? It's my pleasure to welcome you all today to Congregation Beth Am and to our 2021 Guthaner lecture, which is supported by the Ernst Guthaner Endowment Fund for Cultural and Educational Programming. Our longtime member, Dr. Diana Guthaner, established this fund to honor the memory and work of her father, Ernst. Born in 1910, Ernst grew up in the small mining town of Hindenburg in Germany. He first attended a Jewish school and then transferred to a gymnasium where he received a standard classical education that would continue to shape so much of his actions and attitudes throughout his life. Even during medical school in Freiburg and Breslau, he found time to study Latin, Greek, French, and Spanish, languages he would read and recite regularly and with enthusiasm into his twilight years. Ernst narrowly escaped the Holocaust by emigrating to Australia in April 1939. The rest of his family would not survive the war. Life in Australia was enormously challenging, but there he married, raised a daughter, and built in Brisbane a thriving medical practice and an incredible reputation as a clinician. Ernst attained his greatest happiness by interacting with people through his teachings of literature and history. Above all other attributes, Ernst was a classic scholar, a thinker, a curious mind. His daughter, Diana, who is also a thinker, possesses a curious mind and is a successful physician, ensured that our congregation would have an annual opportunity to interact with one another through high-quality teachings of literature, history, and culture. And today, we are privileged to welcome Dr. Akiba Lerner as our Guthaner lecturer. Dr. Lerner is Associate Professor of Religious Studies at Santa Clara University. He received his BA from the University of California at Berkeley and his master's and PhD in Religious Studies from Stanford University in 2007. He taught at Stanford from 2007 to 2009 and joined the Santa Clara faculty in 2009. His research focuses on modern Jewish thought, theologies of hope, Jewish social ethics, political philosophy, American pragmatism, and contemporary liberal thought. His current scholarship focuses on Jewish thought, film, and the dialectics of humanist and authoritarian themes within religion. Diana, when I read in the short biography that you wrote about your father, that Ernst possessed a, quote, streak of defiance or rebelliousness, I realized that by inviting Akiba to be our lecturer today, we had chosen just the right scholar to honor your father's memory. In addition to being a talented scholar and teacher, Akiba also possesses a streak of defiance. I consider him a joyful contrarian and a bit of a rebel. One of my first friends, who is a true native of California, Akiba has long represented for me, a native Bostonian, what we in New England consider quintessential characteristics of Northern Californians. He loves to surf, to mountain bike, and his free spirit was shaped by his upbringing in Berkeley. Akiba and I first met one another through our wives who were in Ulpan together when we were both studying in Israel in 1999. The four of us ended up having adventures together, first in Israel, and then during periodic visits with one another on the East and West coasts. Life is never boring with Akiba. The one and only time that I have gone surfing was with him. Many years ago, he lent me a wetsuit, a surfboard, and a helmet, and then led me into the cold March waters off of Pacifica. It was memorable, so memorable that I have never again gone surfing. Akiba, it's a pleasure to welcome you to Congregation Beth Am. Of course, we would have preferred to be with you in person, but we will settle for this online gathering. We are excited to learn from you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jeremy, for that wonderful, warm introduction. Thank you, Congregation Beth Am, for having me. Thank you to the Guthaner Endowment Fund for Cultural and Educational Programming. It's really great to be with you here today on this late Sunday afternoon. As Jeremy mentioned, our wives met in Ulpan in Jerusalem over 20 years ago. And yeah, I'd forgotten about taking you surfing. I was actually thinking about the adventure we had going to Bethlehem for Christmas, as well as the conversation we began over 20 years about Judaism, and a conversation that we've been able to continue having with each other for over 20 years. So that's been a great joy in my life, and I really appreciate you bringing me here today. So I'm feeling deeply blessed and honored to be with you all here, and I want to talk about a very difficult topic, namely, what does it mean to have hope at this particular moment in history, right? Particularly when we're in the midst of a political, social, economic, physical, and mental health, environmental storm that often seems to be looming on the horizon, or sometimes seems to come crashing down, like in President Biden's terms, like a firestorm that swept over the Capitol on January 6th, or more recently, the storm of rockets falling on Jerusalem and Tel Aviv and Gaza. Now, keeping with this imperfect weather metaphor, at times there seems to be signs that this or that particular storm cloud is dissipating. At other times, it seems like only more storm clouds are gathering. In other words, given that this is a time of so much personal and social uncertainty, how much faith or confidence can we have in a larger sense of hope for ourselves and for humanity? Now, when overwhelmed by such large existential and metaphysical questioning, I find comfort in looking back towards the intellectual resources from previous generations and from our heritage that can be drawn on as a source of shelter and inspiration for igniting a flame of ultimate hope within ourselves that can be carried into the future. The 20th century German Jewish intellectual Erich Fromm wrote that there is a peculiar paradoxical quality to hope, and that hope always involves a dialectical struggle with feelings of despair on the one hand, right? Despair often resulting from fears and doubt about the future, as well as lingering traumas from the past. Thus, to talk about hope at this moment, we have to acknowledge the trauma that we've all collectively been going through, especially with reference to this period of living with the fear and uncertainty unleashed during the COVID-19 pandemic. And then the added political storm that engulfed our nation during the election period and continues to sow fundamental feelings of dread and doubt regarding America's grand liberal democratic project. The audacity of hope that inspired many Americans during the Obama years has given way to fundamental political doubts, such as, will the American experiment with pluralism thrive, or will it shrink due to greater sectarian and tribal polarization? Are we capable of reaching greater levels of equality and rectifying generations of suffering caused by economic inequality, racism, sexism, homophobia? Or are we reaching the breaking point of our moral capacity to recognize ourselves in the face of the other, as Levinas would have us do? Are we really able to manage such staggering cultural differences resulting from our vast geographical distances, urban versus rural, cosmopolitan versus nationalist, and the list goes on and on. So in my talk today, my goal is to present a few illuminating paths of thought that I believe can be helpful for at least framing how we ought to approach thinking about hope in the shadow of so many storms. So I first want to start with a few essential terms, right? I begin by proposing that one of the most compelling, sometimes problematic aspects of Judaism are the variety of redemptive hope narratives developed over the centuries. Now, what do I mean by redemptive hope narratives? In my book, Redemptive Hope, I propose that redemptive narratives developed from an essential human need to be inspired, to feel a sense of basic existential motivation and hopefulness that can help propel us into the future, as well as help us ward off demons of despair we may be experiencing in the present. As individuals, we have proximate hopes for a variety of personal goals. Like tonight, I have a very proximate hope for a delicious dinner, right? I'm sure all of you are sharing in that hope. However, when we start to link these hopes to broader universal visions of how society or the world might someday come to reflect in theological terms an overcoming of the alienation between the world and the divine, or in more secular terms, and by the supreme good, then at that point, individual hopes become linked to a larger redemptive narrative, such as, I hope one day for all peoples of the world to have enough to eat for dinner each and every night, or in more classical philosophical terms, one day we will return to a more authentic and wholesome state of existence, like what once existed in the Garden of Eden, for example. Or one day justice will rain down like a waterfall, and we will finally establish a society based on our highest principles and not just on what we imagine possible within current conditions. The specifics of these ideas have changed and evolved throughout history. Yet the constant impulse found within most redemptive hope narratives is the transcendental yearning to go beyond merely what is for a higher vision of how we ought to live, an expression of our ultimate hopes for what humanity may one day be able to achieve. Now, the biblical stories of Exodus and prophetic proclamations that, for example, Isaiah's vision that the Temple of Jerusalem will one day be a house of prayer for all peoples, link the future welfare of a particular people, namely Israel, with a broader universal redemption for all peoples when, at the end of days, Acheret Hayamim, or in the world to come, Olam Haba, divine judgment will come from on high, resurrect the dead, and sweep away the forces of iniquity. The grand teleological model given to us by the biblical tradition also promises a final conclusion to human history, a final grand Sabbath of eternal peace when all the struggles within history are brought to a conclusion at the end of days, when, as suggested by the prophets, the whole earth will share in a single united reconciliation with the divine and thereby achieve universal rest within a state of spiritual harmony. What makes redemptive narratives, such as those linked to the biblical tradition, existentially compelling is that they orient individual hopes towards a broader horizon that provides a sense of ultimate purpose and transcendence. But there is often a tension between ultimate redemptive hopes for a new world based on our highest principles in contrast to the realities, the often harsh realities we face. So in more analytical terms, hope always involves a tension between the realism of what we can consider to be currently probable versus our idealism of what we think ought to be possible. We need redemptive hope narratives that can inspire transcendental idealism. Yet these very same narratives create problems, both philosophically and theologically, by encouraging feelings of hopefulness and irrational passions that can eclipse realistic expectations and encourage the embrace of absolutist politics at the expense of pragmatic compromise. Historically, religious hopes in the West have tended to orient us vertically towards imagining a heavenly Jerusalem eventually established down here on earth. Whereas the modern turn towards secularism and political revolutions ushered in by the Enlightenment shifted the ground of hope towards a new optimism based on unleashing humanity's intellectual and imaginative potentials. This new optimism was grounded in a horizontal ideal of secular utopianism that looked to unleash the power of our intellects through science and the bonds of human solidarity, combined with a commitment to the civil rights of individual emancipation as an alternative grounding for religiously defined ideals of redemption. This modern secular optimism that looked to human reason as an alternative horizontal bond for human solidarity, in contrast to the vertical gaze of religion, began to crumble, however, as both the inequalities that define the feudal world continued to undermine faith in liberal democratic regimes, and as the faith in science became increasingly undermined by the technological advances in weaponry responsible for the horrors unleashed during the Great Wars, the Nazi death camps, and the nuclear arms race. From the ashes of despair generated by mid-20th century totalitarian regimes, Jewish and Christian theologians and Jewish intellectuals since World War II have set about trying to resuscitate Western discourses of redemptive hope that are both attuned to the abuses caused by faith placed in religious and secularist utopian redemptive narratives, while still drawing on these very same narratives in order to answer that fundamental existential question formulated by the German Enlightenment philosopher Immanuel Kant, namely, as a rational agent, what can I legitimately hope for? Against this historical backdrop, some secular intellectuals like Richard Rorty and Jürgen Habermas continued the liberatory rhetoric from the Enlightenment that despite the horrors unleashed during the 20th century, we can answer Kant's question by pragmatically embracing civil dialogue in the public sphere, solidarity with fellow citizens as an alternative source offered by religion for grounding social hopes. A secular pragmatic faith in the mutual commitments of liberal citizens to democratic debate can serve as a sufficient guardrail for keeping democracy from spinning off the tracks into the ravine of tribalistic sectarian conflicts, or so they hoped. These previous years of Trumpism and its continued political potency amongst large segments of American citizenry, however, have profoundly shaken any liberal democratic faith placed in the mutual commitment to democratic debate as serving as a sufficient foundation for maintaining solidarity within the diversity of interests that define America today. The vision of a secular liberal public sphere that relies on the discursive debate as a means for adjudicating differences and reaffirming a sense of citizenship is increasingly giving way to what I consider to be a postmodern tribalism. As recently suggested by many opinion pieces generated after the January 6th insurrection at the Capitol, it's hard not to entertain the possibility that we might in fact be living through another Weimarian moment in which democratic institutions become increasingly weakened as part of a broader global descent towards authoritarianism. The cultural and political forces that brought Trumpism into being make it increasingly difficult to affirm the liberal democratic hopes that we can both celebrate a diversity of interests, final vocabularies, and identities that have made it difficult to agree upon a singular vision of a common good, but we can still have hope to have enough of a shared commitment to a unified common ground with regard to respecting democratic institutions and a basic right like voting. It's not clear this is possible any longer. Populist rage entrepreneurs who break through what John Dewey referred to as the crust of convention by galvanizing working class grievance politics in the service of plutocratic interests has revolutionized and perhaps has fundamentally changed our ability to ground collective hopes in a procedural republic that relies on basic commitments to shared understanding of simple things like facts, like what it means to win an election and what counts as sound medical science regarding pandemics like COVID. The divisive role of social media and amplifying sensationalist rhetoric designed to induce emotional outrage that can be easily manipulated by sending consumers down rabbit holes of disinformation necessary for sectarian identity formation are essential factors that led to the rise of QAnon and the insurrection of January 6th, based on the promotion of the big lie regarding Trump and the election. Consequently, with fake news, infobots, Russian and other nefarious international actors manipulating our open society by using our very own social media to undermine democratic discourse, institutions, and culture, is increasingly hard to shake the underlying concern that perhaps the center cannot hold. At such moments when it seems like yet again, as Marx predicted, all that is solid melts into air, I have to admit that I can't help but having some nostalgia for the foundational certainty provided by the Enlightenment and the fantasies of ideals of objectivity, universalism, and the presumed neutrality of upholding fact-value distinctions that are essential for pursuing basic projects like science or old-fashioned ideals like a singular truth. On the other hand, as much as I would like to believe in the redemptive return to Enlightenment values as a possible source of hope and for really resaving us, for a number of reasons, the championing of a return to Enlightenment is likely not going to work. Okay, so by now you're probably thinking, we get the problems, so where's the hope, right? Well, for Jews, part of the answer lies in our past, right? An ability to appreciate history, to remind ourselves of these moments, during these moments of vertigo and uncertainty. These were also faced by previous generations, right? After World War II, for example, feelings of despair and uncertainty and cynicism defined the social and intellectual landscape. Elie Wiesel summarized the dilemma faced in trying to formulate an intellectually respectable path forward out of the ashes of Auschwitz and Hiroshima when he wrote, quote, "Wherever we turn after Auschwitz, we find only despair. If we turn to God, we ask ourselves, how and why can I believe? If we turn away from God, we ask ourselves, where can I go? To human beings? Have human beings earned our trust and God? No matter in which direction we look, we are surrounded by the same dark mystery." And the paradox in this is that despite everything, and in defiance of everything, we must have faith. Even if we find no faith, we must raise it up in the hope that one day we will understand why, and that one day we will be able to give a reason for believing. Unquote. The Jewish tradition teaches, for example, to look back to our history of liberation from slavery in Egypt, the promise and hope birthed through the mythological memory of experiencing ourselves as both redeemed from slavery and receiving revelation at Mount Sinai, or their foundations within our tradition for believing in a redemptive horizon. Based on this shared mythological experience, keeping this narrative of hope alive is foundational to what it means to see oneself as part of the Jewish tradition. As the famous mid-20th century German Jewish philosopher and theologian Emil Fackenheim put it, what does it mean to be a Jew? One who hopes. How must a Jew wait for the messianic redemption? He must both act as though all depended on him and pray as though all depended on God, unquote. Fackenheim elaborates on this central thesis in this essay, The Commandment to Hope, where in the wake of World War II, he proposed that Kant's question regarding what we can legitimately hope for can no longer be answered in purely rationalist terms defined by the Enlightenment. Rather, although Fackenheim was a philosopher trained in the tradition of German idealism, Fackenheim proposed that in order to project a vision of hope for our future, it is in fact necessary to return to the foundational ideal of revelation and the heteronomy of viewing ourselves as commanded to hold on to hope despite all the evidence, as President Obama talked about in his book, The Audacity of Hope. When confronted with the despair resulting from realizing the absurdity of hope for humanity in the face of our inclination to embrace various forms of apocalyptic nihilism, and here Fackenheim is thinking of Hitler, fascism, and kind of Darwinian forms of survival of the fittest, Fackenheim proposed, as to counter this, a 614th commandment. Essentially, we are commanded to affirm hope as the only ethical, not necessarily rational, but the only ethical response to the forces of nihilism. According to Fackenheim, the defining worldview upon which fascism is built rests on a belief that nothing but power really matters, since death ends all. Consequently, the reality of our finitude, as emphasized by philosophers like Nietzsche and Heidegger, suggests there is no greater meaning to our existence than the struggle to resolutely affirm our will to power. So Fackenheim argues to counter this kind of nihilism, right, especially the kind of nihilism that can set in when we're confronted with so much evidence, right, for why it'd be naive to have faith in humanity. Fackenheim proposed seeing ourselves as commanded to hope so that we find the motivation to continue to work for redemption, to work for tikkun, but at the same time with the humility to realize that ultimate transformation of the entire world, as promised within the Jewish messianic tradition, is something that has to be left in God's hands. As Elie Wiesel pointed out after the Holocaust, and so much suffering throughout history, we may never be able to accept as our ancestors did, theodicies of comfort for why evil often triumphs. Nevertheless, despite all the evidence, we also can't simply give up on a central part of our humanity, which is expressed precisely by our ability to hope and reject despair. The literary critic Terry Eagleton nicely sums up the pragmatic need for embracing hope, even when the evidence for doing so is grim. As he states, quote, "True hope is needed most when the situation is at its starkest, a state of extremes that optimism is generally reluctant to acknowledge. Hope should not always be coupled with the doctrine of progress. There may indeed be progress in history from time to time, but is not to be confused with redemption. Given that the most glaring obvious fact about the Messiah is that he does not come, it falls to each generation to exercise a small portion of his power on behalf of the oppressed, bringing the poor to power and the hope of hastening his advent. In this sense, the Messiah's absence is not contingent, but determinate. It clears a space in which the task of redeeming history is placed in the hands of humanity. There may be no hope, but unless we act as though there is, that possibility is likely to become a certainty." End quote. This is from his book, Hope Without Optimism from 2014. Okay, so now I'm at the conclusion of my talk. Eagleton's advice to act as though there is hope is especially relevant with regard to perhaps the most ominous storm clouds brewing on the horizon, namely the ecological crisis that is unfolding before our eyes. Although the evidence is bleak that we will be able to counter what Naomi Klein refers to as an ethos of disaster capitalism and extractivism that has brought us to the brink, nevertheless, we have to see ourselves as commanded to hope, and most importantly, work as if there is a future worth sacrificing for. Fackenheim reminds us that the commandment to hope entails a dialectic of both working and waiting. We must work by embracing the praxis of joining with others to make concrete changes, either through activism, philanthropy, or other ways of reducing our impact on the environment, while at the same time balancing our sense of agency and hubris with the Jewish redemptive hope of waiting for the Messiah, which we can be reinterpreted to mean a recognition that there are limits that we as individuals and as a people are capable of accomplishing. When it comes to taking on the enormity of the ecological challenges we face, The waiting for the Messiah component stressed by Fackenheim continues to strike me as both real and delusional. Real, because given the seduction to worshiping the golden calf of unchecked economic progress, coupled with the seductive ideology of convenience that compels an embrace of unchecked consumerism, the level of economic and social transformation required for humanity to change its relationship to the environment makes it hard not to conclude that messianic redemption is the only rational hope for saving us from what might be a collective death instinct causing us to disregard daily our current path towards ecological destruction. And at the same time, and as Fackenheim also seems to suggest, waiting for the Messiah is also dangerously delusional, because waiting on God can easily become an excuse for apathy, or even worse, apocalyptic nihilism, as we're seeing embraced by many religious fundamentalists across the world. In his essay, The Commandment to Hope, Fackenheim elaborates on this dialectical tension between working and waiting for redemption by citing the Hasidic tale about a rabbi who was asked, "Is there a greater role for atheism?" To which the rabbi responds, "When confronted by a poor person, do not say, God will take care of it. Rather, better to believe like an atheist that there is no greater providential force within the universe that's going to make everything okay." Right? Don't use that as an excuse for avoiding your individual responsibility to take action and to lift up others. Thus, the best way to affirm hope in ourselves and within others is precisely to imagine that it is up to us to make our redemptive hopes reality and create the world we want to live in and hand over to future generations. Figuring out how to rectify this short-sighted plundering of the earth and its resources has become the greatest challenge of our generation, and is the most pressing existential threat for future generations. To face this challenge, we are going to need innovations in technology, but also extra doses of redemptive hope. The rabbinic statement is not incumbent upon us to complete the task, nor are we allowed to desist from it. It's another way of affirming the praxis imperative of joining with others to take concrete steps towards healing our planet, while also recognizing at the same time that our gains will likely be small and that there are rational limitations for what we can ultimately hope, especially with regard to enacting the radical reforms necessary for saving the environment. And yet, we are still commanded to view ourselves as agents and potential beacons of hope for others, precisely by acting as if we are justified in holding on to our redemptive hopes for saving the planet. Although this period has seen the deepening of major cracks in the foundations of democratic social hopes globally, the storm we've been living through has also reinforced the realization, in contrast to libertarian fantasies of radical independence and rugged individualism, we are all actually interconnected and mutually dependent on the well-being of others, especially those often overlooked at the margins of the economy and society. Low-income workers, health workers, first responders, farm workers, grocery workers, Amazon workers, the list goes on and on. The revelation of this moment also calls out for reimagining our social contract and the renewal of commitment to our communities, nation, and sense of global citizenship. To return to the Exodus narrative, there have been many days since the start of the pandemic that I'm sure most of us feel like we are collectively stuck wandering like our ancestors in the desert and languishing in some type of wilderness, waiting for hopeful signs on the horizon. And at such moments, it is also good to remind ourselves that our tradition tells us that every day a revelatory voice goes out from Mount Sinai. Thus, the question then becomes, what do we need to do to properly hear and interpret the meaning of this divine call? How can we imagine honoring that spark of hope from Sinai each day, each hour in our everyday interactions? If we want hope for our future, only we can make the future something worth hoping for. To affirm the voice going out from Sinai is to affirm on a daily basis the hope that comes from standing against the dark and stumbling together towards greater fulfillment. Never to be fully realized, but also never to be abandoned for ourselves and future generations. Thank you. Toda Rabah, and may we someday hopefully all meet together in person. All right, thanks. Those are my thoughts on hope at this historical moment.
Great. Thank you so much, Akiba. That was excellent. And you know, there was that moment, you felt it too in the midst of your talk, where we were going down, 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 and then you helped bring us up and ended helpfully with words of comfort and nechemta, proper nechemta at the end of your talk. We have some time for questions for Dr. Lerner, and I'm going to ask you to use your, all of you on the Zoom are now incredibly well versed with the electric hand function to raise your hands, and I'll call on you. And while you're thinking about questions you might have and getting into the queue, I wanted to start with a question for you, Akiba.
Yeah.
And you know, as you were speaking, I was, for those who do not know, Akiba has two children, one of whom is about to go off to college in the fall. And the question I wanted to ask you was, if your daughter, or when maybe she does this, and his daughter is someone, you know, really smart, really well educated, really plugged into the world, if she comes to you and says, Dad, this thing is a mess. This world we're in is a mess. How can I have hope? And what should I do? What would you tell her if she came to you today with that question? And would you tell her the same thing if you had the same, you know, if she was 18 5 years ago and you were talking to her, would you tell her the same thing? And if you were having the conversation 50 years ago, would you tell her the same thing?
Well, that's challenging, right? Because for something to be truthful, it has to be universal and therefore eternal, right? So if I'm conveying the truth, I would like to think that it stands 50 years ago, 100,000 years ago, right? In a sense, I would say, I think what I would say to her would hold, would hold now, and you know, maybe future generations will be watching this, and maybe will, you know, I hope it holds for them as well. So, I mean, basically, what I like about a lot of the thinkers that I've gotten to know on this kind of journey with hope over, you know, many years is the dialectical quality of it, right? In the sense that the thinkers that I find most compelling, right? I mean, there's a tension amongst intellectuals about how to think about hope, right? You have those who are more religiously oriented who argue, listen, forget about human beings. There's no way you can you know, place your hope in human beings. It has to be purely theological, right? There has to be metaphysical foundations for your hope. And if you don't have those theological metaphysical foundations, forget about it. You're doing optimism, you're doing other things, but you're not doing hope, because the fact is it's not going to hold up when things get bad, right? And so therefore, you know, optimism is always tied to specific kind of quantifiable evidence, right? Namely, are you making progress? Well, how do you know you're making progress? Well, you can chart these things out, and there's empirical ways of verifying whether or not you're making progress. Hope is something different than optimism, right? Hope is something that's transcendental. It can't always be affirmed with the evidence that's given, right? It's certainly tied to probabilities, right? You don't want to, you know, be delusional, but at the same time, hope is something that is transcendental and looking at probabilities, but also fundamentally transcendental, right? So there's a debate about how much do you put the emphasis on the metaphysical when you're talking about hope. For a lot of theologians and philosophers, the only sufficient way to ground your hopes is if you have some kind of theological, philosophical, metaphysical grounding for that hope, right? That starts to break down in the West, where that story that we've been telling ourselves starts to break down, and hope shifts towards there's the whole shift towards the horizontal and towards people, and the idea, hey, we can affirm just our relationships with other human beings, right? Then World War I happens, World War II, and we're like, oh crap, I don't know about this, right? And this is where Freud starts to develop his whole theory of the death instinct and thanatos, and this idea that you know, our pleasure instinct is actually sometimes eclipsed by a death instinct, and And maybe we're just tragically conditioned in that kind of a way, right? So this is where Elie Wiesel is so great in kind of bringing us to this dialectical moment of where do we go, right? And I'd say, we got no option. We need both, right? This is what Fackenheim is trying to give us, right? We need both. We need both places. In the sense, I would say to her, there has to be some kind of transcendental source for hope. I mean, hope necessarily puts you in a kind of transcendental frame of thinking, right? And I think that's important. On the other hand, we know that if you go purely towards the theological and the metaphysical, you're going to be most likely disappointed, right? We've all been waiting for the Messiah for a very long time, right? So there's and this is what Zionism was so great at, is saying, listen, Mashiach lo ba, we're not going to wait any longer, right? We're not waiting for the Messiah. We're going to take charge. We're going to make it happen on our own, right? Now, inevitably, as all human projects are, it gets messed up, right? As a result, and kind of falls short of the ideal. But nonetheless, living with that tension, I think, is what I would say to her, is to say, hey, look for ways of affirming your sense of hope on a transcendental level, right? Which is, there's various ways of doing that, spiritually, philosophically, right? But some sense of transcendental hope that's always going to allow you to transcend what is for what might be, right? Because that's very important. On the other hand, you need to have the the affirmation of hope in your everyday interactions. And this is what I think is the thesis behind Hasidism, right? Hasidism takes the transcendental and says, you know what, you can experience this in your everyday, right? So we're gonna, as Buber talks about with the greatness of Hasidism, according to Buber, is that it affirms everydayness, that there's a sanctification of making the mundane into holy, lifting up the fallen sparks from the shells of existence, and finding that in the everyday. And part of what I argue in my book that Buber's arguing is actually, and you find this in I and thou encounters with other people. So you have to find it through relationships with other people. And part of what's been so hard, right, is that we've all been so isolated, right? So that social component to redemptive hope has made it so we've had to go very metaphysical, right? Because we're all existing in this weird realm where like that, the kind of the physical intersubjective reaffirmation of our redemptive hopes isn't really all that possible, right? Or it's very localized, very, very localized, right? So that makes it very difficult. And at such moments, I mean, this is where I've largely reaffirmed, the metaphysical and the theological for myself, because it's at such moments that you have to draw on something that isn't dependent upon the social. So you asked a question about 5 years ago, that's the big difference, right? That would be the big difference, is that 5 years ago, I would say there's ways in which, you can find sources of hope within communities, within your interactions with other people. Now it's a lot harder, and it's been compounded by, it's not just the isolation of COVID. It's also, and this is part of what my talk tragically focuses on, it's also that there's been a breakdown, right? We don't have the same, because Rorty and Habermas, they're part of a secular tradition that is trying to make the claim, listen, we don't need all this theological stuff any longer. We can just rely on the social solidarity we create with our fellow citizens. Well, Trumpism has made it really hard to feel that is true in the same way that it used to be. Now, it's still true. It's still possible. I'm not saying that's all, that Trump has destroyed all that secular kind of faith in the social and the social hopes that we can find solidarity with other citizens. But it's been severely undermined, shaken in a profound way that is going to take a lot of work for it to recover, right? And so that's why at such moments, you got to have something a little bit deeper, in my opinion. And that's where the transcendental, the theological, the metaphysical comes in as a way to kind of help us get to a place where we can reaffirm the social bonds that then kind of are springboards for believing in a social hope again. So that would be part of my answer. to my daughter. if
Would
she
she
had.
listen? Would she listen the whole way through? I wonder. Uh,
That's a different question.
yes, exactly. Jean, you have a question.
think
Oh, I
I'd be the,
You're good.
am I on? I'm
Yeah,
okay.
You're good.
I didn't think I'd be the first one up, so I'm a little screwed out. I'm sorry. I- right now, you talked about Trumpism, and that we know is a catastrophe, was and is 50% of the population still there almost. But I'm also concerned. I'm a longtime Democrat. I consider myself liberal, but I'm getting increasingly alienated, or I've been pushed out by the progressives. And that to me is the scariest, part of what's happening. Whether it's California ethnic studies, my God, where they want to teach hate. They want to teach hate. I mean, I can go the spectrum. I'm sure you've heard it all. Okay. All the progressive movements, LGBT, all them, Zionism is the worst thing in the world. That's it. Nothing else. I mean, I don't know what to say. It is very scary that my home, okay, the other 50% is also way out there and alienating. And that's where I'd like you to, can you talk about hope there?
Yeah, that's it's really tough. I gotta tell you, it's been so since Jeremy brought up my daughter Ellie, who's graduating high school in 2 weeks, going up to college. She's also right now, actually earlier today, we were talking about an editorial piece that she's working on for her high school newspaper, precisely on this issue and the kind of anti-Semitic tweets from fellow classmates at her high school that she's seeing coming out during this latest round of fighting in Gaza, and how disturbing it is, and explaining to her classmates why, the fine line of how a lot of these tweets end up crossing over into anti-Semitism, right? And the difficulty, I think many of us who consider ourselves progressive and want there to be a better situation for Palestinians, want there to be a better situation for all peoples of the world, find ourselves increasingly assaulted, is the only real word for it, right? We're physically, but also just the bombardment that we've seen in the last few weeks, psychologically, online and elsewhere, of this, overwhelming hate for Israel, overwhelming hate for Zionism that always tends to border on something that feels like anti-Semitism. And sometimes, I worry about using that term in order to shut down very legitimate criticism of Israeli policy. And I do worry that often it gets evoked too early in the conversation as a way to shut that down. And so that can be very problematic as well. But Jean, I hear you, and I share your frustration, and I share your concern. And frankly, I can say, well, this is, going back to dialectics, this is the dialectic that Trumpism, first we had Obama, and then Trump is kind of the dialectic swing to the opposite, right? I mean, I'm a fan of Hegel, right? One of the great kind of philosopher of history, who always says that this is how history functions. There's this dialectical tension back and forth, and you just got to kind of deal with the swings back and forth. And so this is kind of, we're living in a heightened crisis moment in which taking a deep breath, trying to step back from it, trying to cool tempers, and try and sort out what's legit and not legit in the various critiques from both the right and the left, right? Really becomes the imperative of the moment. But it's hard not to feel like we're getting it from both sides, right? We're being attacked from the right, and now we're really seeing the left, right? Now, fortunately, I wrote about this after the Tree of Life massacre, that the right shoots at us, right? let's not let's remember that they come in and massacre us in our synagogues. Okay, so so we have to be mindful that there's a way in which the right has become militarized and emboldened to use deadly force that I think has to stay at the forefront of our consciousness, right, and forefront of our concerns, and seeking allies in that, in part because they're just so much more deadlier, right? And the consequences if they seize power are going to be so much more deadlier for us. But this in no way negates the fact that we also have to be really concerned about the rhetoric that we're seeing on the left and call it out when it really crosses the line, and also say, hey, listen, reciprocity here, right? Let's be allies. And part of being an ally is being sensitive to our issues, just as we're sensitive to other people's issues, right? In ways in which they morally fall short from being the best that they could be, right? And so we should have a little bit of understanding when there are moments in which we get so concerned about our existential survival, we sometimes maybe do things to ensure that survival that isn't always in the most sensitive way that embodies the best of our tradition. But Jean, it's a tough question. It's going to get tougher. So I can't really be a huge voice of hope on that scale, because the issues are the polarization is such that, I mean, this is part of the postmodern tribalism that I talk about, right? That it's very, we're increasingly being pushed in a situation of this kind of us against them, tribal kind of way of thinking. The hope is that we can come out of that, right? And I think as Jews, the meaning that I get from our tradition is that, we're supposed to be light unto the nations. We have a certain role to play in history that's unique. And even though I would like to, sometimes hunker down in my kind of tribalistic thinking and think, okay, just, like as my grandfather would put it, what's best for the Jews in this situation, and kind of forget everything else, right? We have to figure out how to kind of embrace that prophetic sensibility that allows us to build bridges to other people and figure out a way for mutual affirmation of our position. And that I think is going to be the only real way out of this morass. But Jean, absolutely.
Akiba, I just want to say though, because still, I sometimes feel actually still the Jews forget about, if I'm not for myself, okay, who will be for me? I still go there. We're generally out there for everyone. Of course, I'm against hate against, Asians, but, we're out there all the time. But again, if you forget the first part, if I am not for myself, who will be for me? I think that's a big danger. And I think you're saying, what can we do, right? What are the things we can do? And people are saying, where are our allies? Where are our allies? And that's,
right. And I
that's
think
scary.
It's very scary. And I think that from a pragmatic perspective of strategy, redemptive sacrificial love can actually be the best strategy. It's the best way to assure our survival. So the more that we as a community can become a loving force within our communities and within the world, it's actually going to help us survive in this situation, right? Because, let's just face it, we're a small minority. So the more we hunker down and try and think that we're protecting ourselves, right, it can often lead to problems. Now, I don't think that, radical love is the only way to go about trying to engage with other people. But it has to be a balance, right? And I think that, certainly for us here in the Bay Area, where we have a lot of privilege and a lot of ability to have the resources to be seen as reaching out to others, I think that's important. In Israel, it's much more complicated, right? Because they're being physically attacked, and so they can't always respond from a position of love in the way that they may want to, right? And that's a very sad reality. But for me, again, dialectically, I think, one way of being for ourselves is precisely to be as caring and compassion for others as possible. And I think that in many ways is our best pragmatic strategy.
Great. Thank you, Jean, and thank you so much for your responses, Akiba. Miriam, you have a question.
I'm unmuting.
Yeah, it's good.
Okay. I hope you don't mind. I'm speaking from Sydney, Australia. I'm a close friend of Diana's.
That's great.
What concerns, so we do not have the same existential angst that you have in relation to Trump. We've observed it from a distance, but our politics is different. But I'm focused on Israel. I cannot see how Israel is moving in the direction of being a light unto the nations. To me, it's going in the opposite direction. And those of us who care about Israel are becoming more and more disillusioned as the fanatical right-wingers are wagging the tail of the whole country. So I just wondered whether Dr. Lerner has anything to say about what we can do and how we can even argue in defense of these people who live in Israel.
Yeah, I share your despair. I mean, the last 2 weeks has been just feeling so much despair about the Zionist project, a project that I've been connected to in various ways my whole life, and feel still very committed to, and still think that Zionism in the state of Israel can be the highest embodiment of our Jewish ideals. So I don't give up on that hope, but these last few weeks are really, really discouraging, and it's hard not to have despair, Miriam, precisely for the reasons you identified, right? That the religious right is really taking the ship of Zionism in a direction that is not going to be good for both Israel and for the Jewish people, frankly, right? We have to remember there's going to be blowback on all of us if this kind of belligerency continues on the religious right. So I think we have to, I mean, in some ways, the same theme that I talked about with Jean, I think would apply here, Miriam, of we have to reach out and more love to these people and say, hey, we stand with you. We're not going to abandon you, but part of love is tough love, and saying, you have to have a more realistic assessment of what is going to be a winning strategy in the Middle East. And a winning strategy is not going to be having settlements all across the West Bank. I myself served as a paratrooper in the West Bank back in '95, right before Rabin was assassinated. Put my life on the line guarding these settlements, and it was really made clear to me during my time there, literally putting my body on the line, how problematic these settlements were, mostly from a military perspective. It just seemed absolutely ridiculous the way they were spread out. They're indefensible, and they were located in places that necessarily created problems with the local Palestinians. So I always have argued, I don't believe in a complete removal of all the settlements from Judea and Samaria. I don't think that's the right way to go. I believe in a strategic consolidation of settlements into blocks that are most importantly, pragmatically defensible, and give the Palestinians a reason to also believe that they can have a contiguous territory that is connected. And I think, one of the things I find really upsetting about Netanyahu was that we all know that for both sides to achieve some level of peace, both Israel and the Palestinians, there has to be a confrontation with the radicals within both of those camps. And the only way in which that kind of confrontation is going to be possible is if there is a feeling, especially in Israel, since Israel is the more powerful player within that configuration, the only way that it's going to be possible is if Israelis feel like America and that we have their back to take what would be unprecedented steps towards weakening their defensive positions by withdrawing settlers, right, and removing some of the checkpoints and whatnot. So what was so sad under Trump was here was a moment where you had a president that was pretty much saying to Netanyahu, yeah, anything you want, everything goes, no problem. And Netanyahu could have used that moment to say, hey, listen, right-wing religious fanatics, they're moving the consulate to Jerusalem. We have this amazing recognition. We have America having our back. Who knows how long this is going to last for? We have to consolidate our presence here, and we have to move towards a Palestinian state. And he didn't do that. And I don't know if we're ever going to get that moment of that level of support that would allow for a government to confront the right wing in Israel in a positive way, right? Netanyahu could have confronted them in a way that they wouldn't have felt like, oh my God, if we move, the whole state's going to collapse, right? And so that was a really tragic moment, and a missed opportunity. So, now it's going to be a situation in which Israel's going to have to really realize that, it can't keep up this settlement activity at the level that it's doing, and it can't engage in this kind of outrageous behavior that makes Palestinians feel like they're being subjected to ethnic cleansing. They're not. I don't consider what is happening in Jerusalem to be ethnic cleansing, but you can understand why, from the Palestinian perspective, they would feel that way, right? So there has to be steps taken to again reach out to the other side and make them feel like Israel's sincere in reaching out for peace. And unfortunately, Netanyahu and the religious right have been doing just the opposite. And not just, let's remember that the flare-up in violence, completely unjustified, but the flare-up in violence amongst the Arab Israeli communities is also coming at the end of a period in which they're seeing moves within Israel itself towards, right, delegitimizing their presence, right? So there's a lot of teshuvah that needs to happen here, a lot of teshuvah. So yes, Miriam, I share your concerns.
And Miriam, I want to thank you for joining us from Sydney and for making this truly a worldwide gathering on this day. I'm really appreciative, Akiba, of your speaking so broadly, that we invited you here to speak about redemptive narratives of hope. And of course, it had its one context when we made an invitation. The last 2 weeks and more have changed that context. But yeah. I'm appreciative of your willingness to delve into these kind of complicated subjects. That's stating it mildly. There's time for one more question, and I see, Joanne, that you have your hand up. I want to ask, is your question focused specifically on what Akiba spoke about?
Let's say something about the importance of balance in looking at the Israeli-Palestinian situation.
I'm having a hard time hearing.
Yeah,
I don't think we have a good connection. Sorry, and Joanne doesn't have her camera on either, so she might be having bandwidth issues.
Okay, Joanne, what I'll invite you to do is we can follow up with questions to Akiba in email, and if you'd like to send him a question, why don't you send it to me and I'll send it along to him. I want to thank you for all that you've spoken of on this day, and really you've done a wonderful thing for us in bringing together the strands of your academic work, your religious self, and the depths of your religious self. And you've also brought together, of course, in these latest comments, your personal history and the things that you've done in Israel earlier in your life. And so I really want to thank you on behalf of all of us at the congregation for your sharing yourself so readily with us during this hour. as I said when we began, I do hope we'll have an opportunity, we'll just have your family come down for Shabbat one night. That's easy enough. You're up in San Francisco. So I look forward to hosting you in our congregation. I want to thank you. I want to thank you, Diana, for creating this opportunity for Beth Am year in and year out. And our goal, of course, is next year for this gathering, we're going to do it in person and have an opportunity to celebrate together Ernst's legacy, and also to celebrate together this wonderful opportunity to learn and to learn deeply with excellent teachers. So thank you again, Akiba. Thank you all for joining us on this afternoon. Have a wonderful evening. And I look forward to seeing you all very soon, and actually very soon in person. So take good care.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Stay safe, everyone. Bye.
Goodbye.
Thank you.